Chapter 3. Seth comes to a seance. A quote-unquote new set of fingers. An experimental seance was next on the list of experiments for my book. We had only the foggiest idea of what a seance was, never having attended one. We did think that more than 2 people should be involved, though, so we decided to ask Bill McDonald to join us, since he was the only one who knew of our experiments. Bill dropped by on the evening of January 2nd, 1964, and on the spur of the moment, I suggested that the 3 of us give it a try. The results were so surprising that rather than paraphrase Rob's notes, I'm going to include them exactly as he wrote them. For one thing, he was a more objective observer than I was. The very way his notes are written also show his state of mind, his careful attitude, and critical manner. Bill McDonald read the notes and agrees with them. We began by sitting at a small table in our living room. We covered the table with a piece of dark material. The kitchen opens off the living room, so we closed the blinds in both rooms and pulled the curtains over them. Not knowing just how to go about having a seance, we plugged in a small red electric Christmas candle. Our walls are white, so we could see fairly well once our eyes were adjusted. I asked Jane to lay her wedding ring on the table. The 3 of us joined hands around it. Sitting quietly in the dim light, staring at the ring, I realized that the unwary observer might not have too much trouble seeing whatever he wanted to see. A tiny point of light grew on the edge of the ring, but by moving my arm, I discovered I could make the light wink off and on. It was simply the red reflection from the candle, so I placed the candle behind the curtains where the light was diffused. Nothing happened as we stared at the ring again. I began to ask questions out loud at random, but I did not address them to Seth. Then, suddenly, Jane announced in a firm, clear voice, "Watch the hand." It was a command, and I knew that Seth was with us. Jane felt her hand grow cold. With considerable relish, Seth, through Jane's voice, described in detail each effect that followed, so that he said there would be no doubt as to what happened. He began by telling us to watch Jane's thumb. The tip of it began to glow. It seemed to be an internal suffusing of the flesh with a cold white light. There was no radiant effect, merely the changing color of the flesh itself. Since the hand was in shadow, there was no mistaking the change. The glow spread up the length of the thumb to the mound of the flesh at its base, next to the palm. "Watch the mound," Seth said, with more than a little satisfaction. "See the color change and the shadows in the palm disappear? If you want a demonstration, then you shall have it, silly as it is. And now the wrist. See it thicken and turn white?" Jane's wrist did thicken. She sat with the wrist of her left thumb pressed to the tabletop. She wore a black sweater with the sleeves half pushed up, and the cold white light spreading up over the thickening wrist, up to her forearm, to the sweater. Then the hand began to change its general proportions and resembled a paw-like shape. I had the eerie feeling of an animal's forepaw. Jane's fingers, normally long and graceful, had shrunken to stubby appendages, or so it appeared. The glow suffused the palm, eliminating the shadows normally to be seen there, so that it did not seem that the fingers were merely folded over. Slowly, the hand regained normal shape. Jane still sat with her palm up. Now Seth really extended himself. The fingers began to elongate noticeably and to whiten. Then a second set of fingers began to rise up over Jane's own fingers. Now it could have been easy enough for Jane to bend her own fingers into this position, but here the 3 of us now saw the second set rising up long and white. Moreover, This second set had the fingernails on top. Had they been Jane's own fingers, the nails would have been on the undersides and invisible. "For a first attempt, I'm doing beautifully," Seth said. "What do you think of that? Take a good look." For some minutes we studied the effect before us. To me, the extra fingers, bent so grotesquely, looked waxen, almost wet, as though freshly molded. Jane did not appear to be frightened. Then, gradually, the extra set of fingers disappeared. "Now the hand changes again," Seth said. "It becomes a stubby fat one. Frank Withers had a hand like that, just like that. Frank Withers was a fathead," he said, with great satisfaction, even though Frank was, according to Seth, a personality fragment of his own entity. The hand did become stubby and fat for a moment. Then it resumed the paw-like shape. "Now," Seth said to me, "very carefully, reach out and touch the hand. I want you to touch it, so that you can feel what it is like." Gingerly, I touched the fingertips of Jane's palm. The paw-like hand felt very cold, wet, and clammy, and the skin had a bumpy feeling that I wasn't used to in Jane's hand. Seth now had this cold inner light suffuse Jane's wrist and palm to an even more remarkable degree. At the joining of the hand and wrist, the flesh rose up in an egg-like lump. The white crept up Jane's arm to the sweater and bled down her fingers, until all semblance of shadow was gone from the arm and palm. Then, to end this part of the demonstration, Seth had Jane place her hands side by side on the table, so that we could plainly see the difference between the two. Gradually, the hand returned to normal, and Seth instructed us to take a rest period. After the break, Seth told us to shut the door leading to the bath. The living room side of the door holds a full-length mirror, and Seth told us to look into it. Since the mirror is tall and narrow, we had to crowd in close on 3 sides of the little table in order to see our reflections. Jane sat in the middle. Her lips were very close to my ear as she talked. I could hear and feel each breath, each swallow she took. Her voice dropped considerably in volume, and I really had the sensation that she was indeed speaking for someone else, rather than for a subconscious personality, for example, who just called itself Seth. "Now the 3 of you see your reflections clearly in the mirror, just as you should. Watch, for I'll change Jane's image and replace it with another," Seth said. And Jane's image did begin to change. Her head dropped lower. At the same time, the shape of the skull changed. The hair grew shorter, and fit about it much more closely. The shoulders of the mirror image hunched over, and grew more narrow. And then, the head in the mirror tilted and looked down, while Jane herself sat with her head erect, staring straight ahead into the mirror. Jane said later that this shocked her more than anything else. I looked at her first beside me, then in the mirror. There was no doubt as to the difference between the two. I also saw a shadow suffuse the mirror image. At the same time, I had the feeling that the face hung forward from the body. The mirror head seemed to grow smaller. I detected a faint glow about it as it hung in space, seemingly between the mirror reflection and the 3 of us. It was also obvious that the mirror image sat several inches lower down than Jane herself sat, and now and then the mysterious head would dip down and then hang forward from the body. End of Rob's notes. During the séance, I hadn't been a bit nervous or frightened. Toward the end, though, I was shocked to see such a difference between my mirror image and myself. I think that I was momentarily afraid that I really looked like that. After all, that's a normal enough reaction. Usually, when you look in a mirror, it gives a faithful reproduction, and no woman is going to be pleased to see a weird-looking apparition staring back. When Seth took over, his confidence knocked all other ideas or doubts from my mind. Yet my eyes were open all the while. I could examine the differences between my hands, for example, and see the other set of fingers, and the white glow that ran up to the edge of my rolled-up sweater. I seemed to quote-unquote click out when Seth spoke, yet a tremendous sense of energy rushed through me as he did so. Except for the mirror image at the end, nothing bothered me. But as soon as the seance was over, I was appalled. Instead of being encouraged by Seth's part in the events, we were upset. We all knew what we had seen. Rob had even touched the hand at one time, and Seth had given us many occasions to check effects as they occurred. We couldn't accept the evidence of our senses, nor could we really deny such obvious evidence. Though we were trying to experiment for the book, we thought that seances were kooky, somehow unrespectable. We didn't want Seth involved, and specifically had made a point of not asking for him. My intellectual skepticism was aroused simply because the affair had been so successful. We argued back and forth as to whether or not suggestion had been responsible, but we knew that this could not explain half of what happened. It could hardly explain the bumpy quality Rob had felt in my hand, or the second set of fingers, though we decided that it could perhaps have accounted for the odd mirror image. Actually, for the first time in our lives, we found ourselves experiencing events that we couldn't explain, and doubting the obvious evidence of our senses, an uncomfortable spot for anyone. The affair had had such an effect upon us that I wouldn't try that kind of a seance again for 3 years. As you will see, however, Seth appeared in apparition form in session number 68. From then on, we always kept lights on for easier checking of any effects that might appear. Later work has convinced me that psychic phenomena do not simply appear because we want them to, or as the result of suggestion alone. Other later effects happened in full light, in a few of my ESP classes, for example. The Seth apparition also appeared in full light. I've also known incidents since when groups of highly suggestible people with little critical sense have gathered in dark rooms expecting all kinds of apparitions, and nothing happened at all. I think Rob and I were angry at being brought up short, forced to face issues